Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Political defections aren't anything new and not something that the BJP alone should be held accountable for in the two southern states, Goa and Karnataka, as well as in the Rajya Sabha, where 4 out of the 6 TDP members resigned and joined the Treasury benches. Crossing the aisle has been part of India's democratic process ever since the first elections in 1952. On more than one occasion, the Congress has used the lure of power or cash or both to get the requisite support to govern, a memorable instance being from 1984 when the then Andhra Chief Minister and TDP founder N.T. Ramarao was displaced by N. Bhaskar Rao. That NTR was in the US undergoing heart surgery made the occasion all the more poignant. The events in Karnataka are not new. The usual method of opposition parties has been to lure away ruling party or coalition legislators. This floor crossing in states reached epic proportions in the 1960s and 70s. MLAs in some states changed their political allegiances multiple times during the day. Parliament amended the constitution in 1985 in an attempt to stop this menace and brought in the anti-defection law. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the political crisis in Karnataka and the anti-defection law. Joining me on the program today are B.K. Chaturvedi, former Cabinet Secretary, Satya Prakash, legal editor of the Tribune, and J. Sai Deepak, advocate of the Supreme Court. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Chaturvedi, I'd like to begin the program with you. What do you make of the political nataka, that is drama, in Karnataka?
See, as you observed right in the beginning, it's very unfortunate that the attempts of the parliament and our leaders, our people, to reduce defection and to bring more probity, more cleanliness in our democratic life are being circumvented in one way or the other. Earlier we had this law for 1/3 at least must defect. Then it was felt that still it was not stringent enough. So we had the constitutional amendment in the early 2000s and the Schedule 10 was brought in. And 2/3 majority now was required at least to defect. But now I find that people are finding new ways to let the government be displaced, and this is the qualms of conscience that everyone is trying to now resign from his post. This was, I don't think, was thought of when this constitutional amendment was there. I think we'll have to think about it and how to deal with such situations so that we bring more cleanliness and probity in our public life and in our parliaments. Otherwise, this defection and this lure of money and this lure of power, lure of ministerial offices, this will really be maybe quite often too much for some of our public representatives who would merrily defect. This is very unfortunate. I think we need to think about it and bring in some more rigorous legislations.
Okay. J. Sai Deepak, why was there a need to bring in the law in the first place, and how has the law, the anti-defection law, evolved over the last 30-35 years?
So, I think the infamous phrase Ayaram Gayaram is fairly popular when it comes to the discussion on the anti-defection law, and I think it all started with one MP, I think by the name Gaya Lal, and who managed to change his allegiances thrice in a single day in 1967. But of course, it's a telling story about the response or the sensitivity of our political system, that ultimately the decision to address this particular menace was taken only in 1985. So it took, I think, a couple of decades for us to arrive at a political consensus that this particular issue needs to be addressed. Because ultimately, when somebody decides to cast the vote for a candidate, it's not just a candidate but also for the party that he stands for and the ideology he stands for and the manifesto he stands by. So if defections happen, then practically you are betraying the electorate who have decided to cast their vote in your favor for certain things that they hope that you stand for. So ultimately, this was why the 1985 amendment to the Constitution was effected, and then the 10th schedule was introduced. Both of them are connected to Articles 102 and 191, if I remember it right. And effectively, the purpose of this particular, let's say, mini legislation within the Constitution is to create a deterrent for any kind of defections, and it prescribes disqualification as a means of doing so. Now, over the years, what has happened is the jurisprudence that has revolved around this is whether or not courts have any say as far as this particular matter is concerned, and the 10th schedule is pretty clear on that particular issue, that there is a bar on the jurisdiction of courts. However, what has been subsequently the evolution is, after a decision is taken with respect to the aspect of disqualification under the 10th schedule, courts may have jurisdiction over those aspects after the decision is taken. And there have been instances where people have approached the court for a direction to the speaker for him to take an expeditious decision with respect to disqualification, where in some instances, in fact, there are examples where the speaker has sat over the matter for close to 4 years, and this is called for judicial intervention. But the practice is by and large that you shall not interfere until a decision is taken. Now, the issue that is actually taking place before the in Karnataka and before the Supreme Court is not just a question of disqualification and defection. It is effectively the new aspect that has been thrown into the mix, which is resignation versus disqualification. So, what are the consequences which flow from this? This calls for an interpretation of 3 or 4 provisions of the Constitution. One is Article 190, then Article 164 1B, then the 10th schedule. So, assume for a moment that a resignation is tendered and there is a disqualification proceeding that is initiated either before or after, but the resignation is yet to be accepted by the speaker. Then what is it that the speaker is supposed to do? Take a call on disqualification first, as a consequence of which the resignation becomes redundant, or accept the resignation first, in which case perhaps the disqualification may become redundant. Now, the question here is, if you look at Article 190, it ties both to some extent, and if you look at the arguments that have been reported today between Dr. Singhvi and Mr. Mukul Rohatgi, it is a question of whether you must link or delink the question of resignation and disqualification. Now, the speaker has the power to not accept the resignation if he comes to the conclusion that there are grounds to believe that this resignation is a consequence of either coercion or any other kind of undue influence or inducement. Now, inducement could also mean some kind of a post elsewhere. Therefore, while resignation perhaps has started playing a role for let's say, in a very public manner this time for the purposes of disqualification, this issue was already thought of when Article 190 was actually introduced, that a resignation can be for multiple purposes and need not be necessarily genuine.
Right.
Therefore, here, if the speaker comes to the conclusion that resignation here is effectively connected and linked to the aspect of defection, then perhaps that particular resignation can be kept on hold and it need not be accepted. Now, this takes us to the actual practical consequences. Why should somebody resign first to avoid disqualification? Because if you resign without you being disqualified, then it allows you to become a minister in the current house. But if you get disqualified, you cannot be re-elected in this, you cannot become a minister in the current house until your re-election or until the expiry of the term, whichever is earlier. This is the primary issue that is at the heart of this particular dispute. Now, what is important is, in this case, people have approached the court not with respect to disqualification, but asking for a direction that the speaker take a call with respect to resignation as soon as possible. But since both are connected in this particular case, in the facts of this case, it is as good as a direction being given to take a decision with respect to disqualification, which circumvents the previous jurisprudence to some extent. So, I think the court is also caught in a fix here. Unfortunately, in this case, given the backdrop in which these putative defections are taking place, it is impossible to delink, according to me, the question of resignation from disqualification.
Okay.
If there is a sense of inducement, then disqualification must take precedence over resignation.
Okay, all right. Satya Prakash, let me bring you into the picture now. A couple of aspects. We'll talk about the powers of the speaker and whether the court can intervene a little later. But can the MLAs facing disqualification be tried under the anti-defection law even after they resign?
See, if you ask me, I have the only analogy I can bring to this discussion is the judge's removal. If there is a removal procedure, a proceeding going on against a judge, and the judge chooses to resign, immediately that proceeding ends. So, if I going by that, here also once the resignations are accepted, the disqualification proceedings would be over automatically, because you want to disqualify the person from holding a position that of a legislator. The moment the person has resigned and the resignations have been accepted, the matter should end. But here, as Shahid Deepak has pointed out, it's slightly complicated, because it's both the sides are claiming that the petitioners are claiming that resignations were given first. The other side is claiming that disqualification proceedings were initiated before that. So courts, the Supreme Court will have to actually take a call which one should be decided first. And in both the cases, either way the Supreme Court decides, it will have political consequences for the government in Karnataka. And that is why it's important. But to my understanding, the real problem with anti-defection law is we have tried to solve a political problem through a law. If you try to solve a political problem using law as a tool, it will always have limited application, because politics has its own ways and means of circumventing things and inventing and reinventing things. So here, whatever developments that have taken place in the last few decades post 1985, when the 10th schedule was added to the constitution through 52nd amendment, it has only exposed the limitations of anti-defection law. So it can work only to a particular extent. Initially, there was a provision for a split where one-third members, if they have decided to join some other political group, they are allowed. But it was happening quite often, so the constitution 10th schedule was amended again, and now the concept of a split is over. Now the concept of merger has is there. So now, instead of 1/3, 2/3 of the members, if they decide to quit the original party, then only the merger takes place. So, and even then it's happening. You must have seen that 4 of the TDP 6 Rajya Sabha members, they have joined BJP. 10 Congress members out of 15, they joined BJP in Goa. And 12 Congress MLAs joined TDP in Telangana. TRS in Telangana. So this is how things are happening, and whatever is happening in Karnataka, it should be seen from the larger perspective of failure of this law in checking political defections, because by nature the politics is all about power, and individuals or groups, they tend to shift ideology and go to a political group which can offer them power. But the real problem, one, I said, using law as a tool to check political defection, the larger issue of probity in public life and some sort of ideological commitment, because as Sai has pointed out, because people vote for you not just as a candidate, but also as a candidate belonging to a particular party, ideology, their programs, and the rest of the other things. So if you shift your loyalty from one party to the other,
right,
in a way you are betraying your electorate also. So there has to be some check.
Sure.
But there is another issue. There can be genuine cases where individual MPs or maybe 5, 6, 10 MPs or MLAs, they are not convinced by the line taken by their party. So what should be the situation then? Supposing as a lawmaker, I am not convinced with the stand taken by the party, should I kill my conscience or should I go with the party whip? So there is a real question, and the Supreme Court has already upheld the validity of anti-defection law in Koheto Honoharan case. But then the Supreme Court chose to give practical considerations more weightage than they said theoretical exemptions cannot be given much more weightage.
Right.
While the fact remains that if you analyze Article 105 Clause 2 or Article 194 Clause 2, both of which give complete free speech to MPs, and then they give them protection from any sort of consequences for whatever said they say in the House or the vote given in the House. 10th schedule is somehow going against that.
Right.
At least the spirit of 105 Clause 2 and 194. So there has to be some way out found where the cases in which there are MPs or MLAs, they genuinely feel that they should not be voting on party lines.
Right.
they cannot be forced, and they should not be forced, because after all, if you kill your conscience, then you become a sort of, a sort of pawn in the hands of the your party leaders. So there has to be a way out found, and a balance has to be struck. So far as Karnataka is concerned, by tomorrow morning we'll come to know, because the Supreme Court has reserved the verdict after hearing all the sides, including the Karnataka Chief Minister.
Right.
So tomorrow morning we'll come to know what the,
Sure,
because
absolutely.
this is important, because already the assembly has, the government has sought trust. They are seeking trust vote on Thursday.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Chaturvedi, let's talk about the Speaker and the Speaker's powers, and what is the SOP really as far as the Speaker is concerned when it comes to a situation like this. Does he accept the resignations immediately? What is it that he really needs to look forward to and look out for?
See, Speaker is supreme as far as the House is concerned. The way our Constitution is made, it's clear that there are these three wings, and as far as the procedure in the House is concerned, about Speaker's discussion, Speaker's consideration of the resignations is concerned, Speaker's power is supreme, and he has to consider these issues all right. But in this case, the Speaker has to see particularly carefully, because it is not a one-off case where someone had a qualms of conscience and he felt that the party's policy, the party's legislation was bad, it was in power and he did not like it, or it was in opposition, didn't like it, and therefore he resigned. In this case, there is an en masse resignation of 17, 18 people, and you cannot really say that all this had a simultaneous qualms of conscience on certain issue. There is, the whole thing looks a bit worrisome. I mean, I don't want to use the word fishy, but to me, it looks to me very worrisome that suddenly all of them had qualms of conscience and decided that they would like to resign. I think a Speaker does need to look at it very carefully, whether money was offered, whether posts were offered, whether there were some other allurements because of which they have resigned. Why have they resigned? A Speaker needs to look at it carefully, and I think we should give the Speaker time and not hustle him up in this manner. And I think the courts should respect the Speaker's power in this regard.
All right. Yes, Satyaprakash.
Well, so far as resignations are concerned, if you read Article 190, Clause 3, there are only two requirements. The genuineness of the resignation, whether the resignation is genuine, means the person concerned, he or she has resigned and the signatures and everything are correct. And second is whether it is voluntary or not. I am afraid the Speaker may not be entitled to get into the motives why the person has resigned, and unless there are wild allegations or something that is, I am saying purely political reasons. Supposing I want to resign because I want to quit this position and I want to join some other party, can the Speaker say no, you cannot resign? Because ultimately it is the person's wish. The only thing the Speaker is needed to inquire into is whether the resignation is genuine, and second, he has voluntarily done it or not. The rest of the things, I am afraid the Speaker, because otherwise it will be a never-ending process, and the Speaker or the chairperson, as the case may be, might refuse to accept the resignation, and the person is forced to continue as a member even if he or she wants to. Supposing in a particular situation, forget about Karnataka, any state government or even parliament, central government, razor-thin majority, one member resigns and the government is to fall. Can you actually force that person to continue, even if the person is is quitting because of some personal reason, because your government is going to fall? So, a Speaker, only two things he or she needs to see: whether the resignation is genuine, and second, whether it's voluntarily or not.
Right.
The only thing is, for political considerations, he or she should be entitled to resign, because it's all about politics. The horse trading, taking bribe, rest of the things should be ruled out. But political consideration, of course, it's politics. So people will resign for politics. So there should not be any objection to that.
Okay, all right. Yes, Deepak, so when we are talking about the speaker and when we are talking about the court, can the court intervene when we look at a constitutional authority like the speaker at any point in time, or is that out of the jurisdiction of any court?
I think the court is very, very clear, rather the judgments are very clear that with respect to the actual process, there is very little room for the judiciary to intervene. Perhaps at best when there is an undue delay and it affects, let's say, the administration in some way or the other, perhaps the court can at best request, and in fact even the order of the court is only a request that is made to the speaker to consider disposing of this issue in an expeditious manner as possible. In fact, I just have 2 points to make. I completely agree that perhaps when it comes to these matters, particularly when it comes to property in public life, law cannot perhaps be the solution to each of these issues, and there will always be a mischievous mind that thinks of a backdoor entry or a way to circumvent it. But when the common man asks himself, there must be some kind of a check or a deterrent, and the deterrent that comes to the common man's mind is always the law. There must be some way of addressing this particular issue. Therefore, while I understand that the anti-defection law as it stands today is still perhaps not the best that we may want, it is certainly necessary. Most importantly, what is it that you can do? So, to answer the question of what is it that a conscientious politician can do if he believes that he does not agree with the position taken by his party, resign. Resign first and then go back to the public. But let's ask ourselves, why shouldn't that benefit of doubt be given to the people in Karnataka at this point of time? Because there is a mass resignation all of a sudden, and therefore questions are arising as to what is the intention behind this particular thing. Now let's take this a step further. Your question initially was, can proceedings for disqualification be carried out even after resignation? So here perhaps you can actually take some kind of an inspiration from company law, where even after a person has resigned from his post as a director, he can be held accountable for actions that he took as a director under section 168(2) of the Companies Act. Now what is lacking perhaps in this particular 10th schedule is a clarification that assume for a moment that the speaker accepts the resignation when it is tendered on the belief and in good faith that this has been tendered in a bona fide fashion, and then he comes to realize that something else has happened. The fact that he does not have a legal tool in his hand to actually hold that particular person accountable and to recant that particular resignation is something that is missing as far as the law is concerned. Because once the resignation is accepted, he has to necessarily declare that the particular seat has been rendered vacant. Okay, that is the consequence that immediately flows. Now, if you have certain timelines within which this process is supposed to be undertaken, that is, assume for a moment that you will have a period after resignation until which you are entitled to review that resignation and the reasons for the particular resignation.
X number of days.
Yes, and after that, even if something surfaces, the period is over. Then there's nothing that you can do about it, because there has to be an end to that particular process. This is something that they can consider adding and addressing specifically in light of what has happened in these circumstances.
Sure.
But I certainly believe that given the fact that this is ultimately political, it is well within the rights of the speaker to consider if there are malified political reasons, and you have to strike a distinction between bona fide political reasons and malified political reasons.
Absolutely.
If you believe that the inducement is power, then there is a serious problem. If you believe that ideology is the cause, then there is no problem. But if you believe that greenbacks and money is playing a role, then there is certainly a problem. These are issues that I think that the speaker is well within his rights to get into.
All right. Okay. Closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you, Mr. Chaturvedi. So, has the anti-defection law been effective, or has it served its purpose, or do we need to look beyond it now?
Well, the anti-defection law has served its purpose so far, though it has not really been able to stop defections in several cases. But I think there's a need to look at it again, because in fact no one could imagine that this method of asking people to resign could evolve, or people could have suddenly a mass there could be a mass number of MLAs, large number of MLAs certainly having qualms of conscience. So I think the law needs to be changed again. I agree that answer to all questions is not law, but I think the law does need to be changed again to look after this question where allurement of office or money or other malified reasons are there, and because of which this has come. I think we need to look at it again and make it more stringent and more effective, so that our political life is cleaner than what it has been so far.
Okay, all right. Satya Prakash, let's look at it from a different perspective, from the MLA's perspective now. What happens if these MLAs are disqualified? What options do they have? Do they have some kind of options left before them or ahead of them?
No, because they can always challenge the disqualification before the courts, because a speaker's decision is subject to judicial review. But the real problem with anti-defection law as it stands today, there is too much importance given to the speaker. A speaker's office is treated with so much respect. Even the Supreme Court verdict in which they upheld the anti-defection law, they have also given too much importance to the speaker. Today, the CJI commented that we have given so much importance and respect to this office, but invariably various speakers, they have not acted in a fashion which can be termed as above board. So their partisan conduct has lowered the dignity of the office, and that is why time and again almost invariably all the decisions of speakers, they have been questioned in the court of law. So there is a suggestion that there are two suggestions. One is that anti-defection law should be applicable only in a situation where there is a vote for the survival of the government, trust vote or no confidence motion, or the speaker's power should be given to either to governor, or in the center it should be given to the president, as in the case of office of prophet, or there should be a tribunal which will decide such cases. And this is primarily because of the fact that in the last almost 34 years, the speakers, they have not acted above board. So I don't know which way out is the correct way out, but there has to be some discussion on how to solve these problems. Primarily these issues have been risen because of
But the same can be said about several governors as well who have exceeded their brief.
Because in that case, because the governors in office of prophet case or president, they act on the advice of the election commissioner.
Okay, all right. Closing comment from you, Jesai Deepak, on the best way forward really to deal with this situation going forward.
I certainly understand the point that Mr. Satya Prakash is making with respect to this particular office, the Speaker's office being given too much of importance, or it being placed on an exalted pedestal. And assume for a moment that a roll call, or let's say, or if an opinion was sought from all the speakers ever appointed in this country on whether they believe that every person who adorns the highest post in the judiciary is necessarily neutral, I don't know what their opinion would be. So if neutrality is effectively the question, or bipartisanship, or questions of bipartisanship is the question, then I think anybody can raise questions on anyone at this point of time in this country. So the reason why perhaps the speaker is given that particular position is not because it's an ornamental position, but because he adorns the role of an arbiter between both houses, or rather both sides of the house.
And it's a constitutional position.
It's a constitutional position. Yeah. So to that extent, I think it is important that that position is respected. Now, does the speaker perhaps need an aid from the judiciary when it comes to these matters by tribunalizing these matters? That would perhaps mean, just as the independence of the judiciary is important, the independence of the house from the judiciary when it comes to some of these matters is also something that needs to be protected. Because if our answer is that the judiciary perhaps must have a free rein with respect to each of these aspects, and then everything goes to the judiciary ultimately, I'm not sure whether that would perhaps, let's say, stand the scrutiny of the separation of powers even in that particular sense. Which is why issues of disqualification, issues of privilege. See, when the anti-defection law was considered, they could have very well thought of sending this matter to the judiciary entirely. Yeah. Why did they choose to retain it with the House, and particularly with the Speaker of the House? Because this is about the House, primarily about the House. If there is an issue of allegation, or let's say if there is an allegation of corruption, automatically the law will take its own course under the PC Act. Okay, but if that's not the case and it's a question of defection, it is primarily about the executive and the legislature.
Right.
And therefore they must be allowed to deal with it within the, let's say, 8 corners of the legislature and the executive, and not bring in the 4 corners of the judiciary as far as that issue is concerned. So to that extent, this is the respect that even the judiciary has recognized, as a consequence of which that circumspection and that caution is observed in each of its judgments.
So there's a clear division of power, yes, is what you're suggesting, and that's how it should remain.
Absolutely. Some of these issues are best dealt with within that particular house, or within that particular entity.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.